The last rays of sunlight stretched across the arid Nevada landscape as Charlotte Miller drove south along Highway 93. The desert seemed endless, its flat horizon only occasionally broken by distant rocky outcroppings or the remains of abandoned roadside structures. The sky was painted in fading shades of amber and violet, and the temperature had begun to drop from the brutal midday heat. Inside her black SUV, the hum of the engine was steady, accompanied only by the soft murmur of an encrypted newsfeed playing through the vehicle's internal communication system. She was focused, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel, her eyes flicking calmly between the road and the mirrors. Charlotte was dressed plainly in a dark blazer and slacks. Nothing flashy, nothing that called attention. There were no government emblems visible, no markers that hinted at her position as director of the National Intelligence Center. Her credentials, including a top-level security badge and biometric ID, lay undisturbed in the glove compartment. It was standard protocol on civilian travel: blend in, don't advertise, stay low profile. The route between Reno and Las Vegas was long and mostly deserted. She had traveled it before, and it was supposed to be a routine drive. But routine meant nothing in the face of unpredictability. She noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror before she heard the siren. Red and blue strobe pulses cut through the dusky light. Reflexively, Charlotte slowed down, signaled, and pulled over to the narrow shoulder of the highway. There were no other vehicles around for miles, only the dry wind and the soft crackle of desert insects beginning to stir in the cool of evening. She turned off the engine and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, as trained to do in situations where miscommunication could become dangerous. She waited. The patrol car behind her came to a stop, and for several seconds, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened, and a uniformed man stepped out. He moved deliberately, as if measuring each step. He wore dark sunglasses, even though the sun had nearly vanished. His hand hovered close to the holster at his hip, a silent but clear signal. Charlotte watched him through the mirror. He looked like someone used to being obeyed without question, tall, square-shouldered, with a kind of hardened expression that came less from discipline and more from entitlement. He approached her window, staying slightly behind the doorframe, out of reach. She pressed the button and lowered the window halfway. The officer didn't introduce himself or explain the stop. He gestured curtly, demanding identification. Charlotte remained calm. She offered a brief explanation of who she was and suggested he verify her identity with the county dispatch. It was the correct move, procedural and respectful, but it only seemed to provoke him. His eyes narrowed. Suspicion crept across his face, quickly turning into something more aggressive. He ordered her out of the vehicle. Charlotte, understanding the danger of escalation, complied. She stepped out slowly, hands still visible. The officer wasted no time. He spun her around, pushed her against the hood of the SUV with unnecessary force, and began a rough pat-down. He did not tell her why she had been stopped, nor did he ask further questions about her destination or role. The power dynamic shifted in an instant, one side armed and in control, the other restrained and silent. Charlotte gritted her teeth but said nothing. She felt the cold metal of the hood against her cheek, the pressure of his hand against her back, the absurdity and humiliation of the situation. It wasn't fear that stirred inside her. It was the awareness that this was not about the law, not about safety. It was about ego, about dominance. She had encountered threats before, foreign and domestic, professional and personal, but never like this. Never with so little justification and so close to home. Above them, the last colors drained from the sky. Darkness settled across the highway. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. The patrolman finished his search, still saying nothing about the reason for the stop. His silence was as loud as any accusation, and Charlotte, though outwardly composed, knew that this moment would not go undocumented. It would not go unanswered. The atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile as the second vehicle rolled to a stop behind the first. Dust from the shoulder of the highway curled into the air, illuminated by the headlights like drifting smoke. A younger officer stepped out, Allison Crow, lean and visibly uneasy, her steps hesitant yet deliberate as she approached the scene. Despite the uncertainty in her body language, she quickly fell in line with her partner, Officer Marshall, adopting a stance of authority and echoing his suspicions as if they were her own. Her voice, though shaky, carried the weight of accusation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't seek clarity. She simply reinforced the fiction already in motion. Charlotte remained on her feet, her posture controlled, even as the isolation of the setting pressed down on her. The long stretch of desert highway remained silent, devoid of traffic, witnesses, or interference. The fading warmth of the day had given way to a sharp, dry chill. In the growing darkness, the world around her seemed to constrict, leaving only the sterile beams of two police cruisers to frame the scene. It was a stage built for intimidation, and its players were determined. When she was ordered to her knees, Charlotte hesitated for a breath, calculating the risk of compliance versus resistance. Her training urged restraint, but her instincts recoiled. Kneeling without cause was not only unnecessary, it was designed to humiliate. She warned them, calmly and clearly, about the legality of their actions, about the consequences. But her words were ignored, her rank dismissed as irrelevant, her identity treated as suspect rather than fact. The silence that followed was louder than any denial. With a cold efficiency, Marshall forced her down. The asphalt was rough beneath her knees, still holding the residual warmth of the sun, but rapidly cooling as night descended. A dry wind swept across the empty plain, stirring grit that clung to her clothes and skin. Her bag was pulled from the vehicle and searched without warrant, its contents spilled unceremoniously onto the ground. Her credentials were among the first things to fall, a federal ID, embossed and unmistakable. Crow glanced at it briefly but said nothing. The badge might as well have been a grocery receipt for all the weight it carried in that moment. Every movement by the officers felt deliberate, as if meant to degrade. They acted with the confidence of people who believed they were invisible, untouchable, operating in a vacuum of oversight. Charlotte saw it in their eyes, especially in Marshall's. The way he lingered over each motion, the casual disregard in his posture. This wasn't about suspicion, it was about assertion. They didn't just want to subdue her, they wanted to erase her authority, to make her small. Charlotte remained still, her breathing steady but her mind racing. She cataloged everything, the tone of their voices, the sequence of actions, the placement of their hands, the positioning of the vehicles. And then she noticed the absence of something critical. Marshall's cruiser, the first to arrive, had no visible dash cam light, no blinking indicator, no forward lens activated. It was off, deliberately, a choice, not a malfunction. The realization struck her like a blade through the ribs. He didn't expect consequences. He didn't expect this moment to be seen. That small detail was the most dangerous thing of all. It meant he had done this before. It meant he believed he could do it again. The humiliation deepened as Charlotte remained on her knees, the dust coating her hands, her clothes, the bitter taste of vulnerability sinking into her throat. She had faced hostile interrogations overseas, navigated power struggles within intelligence circles, and de-escalated crises with nothing but her presence. But here, on a forgotten highway in her own country, that presence meant nothing. The uniform, the badge, the system, none of it recognized her here. Only the silence of the desert bore witness to her shame, and it offered no comfort. As the final traces of daylight vanished beyond the desert horizon, the distant flicker of a single headlight emerged from the darkness. It bobbed slightly, a slow-moving vehicle making its way along the otherwise deserted stretch of Highway 93. The vehicle was an old, dust-covered pickup truck, its paint sun-bleached and chipped, but still sturdy enough to navigate the open road. Behind the wheel sat Bill Hopkins, a retired mechanic in his 70s, with a face weathered by time and long hours spent beneath the hoods of cars. He had spent most of his life in small towns scattered across Arizona and Nevada, and he knew this road well. He had seen accidents, breakdowns, and more than a few questionable traffic stops in his day. That night, he was driving home from visiting an old friend in Arizona. The flashing red and blue lights ahead caught his attention immediately. He slowed down, instinctively cautious, and pulled over to the side of the road a safe distance away. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the location, desolate, far from any town or service station. It was the posture of the figure in the headlights. A woman was kneeling on the pavement, her hands behind her back, flanked by two uniformed officers. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't moving at all. Her clothing, a dark business suit, didn't match the context. This wasn't a routine stop. It looked like an arrest without cause. Bill turned off the ignition and sat for a moment, watching. Then he reached for his phone. He had learned over the years that staying silent was often easier, but not always right. He opened the camera app, aimed it toward the scene, and began recording. His movements were slow, deliberate. He stepped out of his truck, the dry gravel crunching beneath his boots. The air was cold now, the desert wind biting at his face. He held the phone steady, walking closer, though still careful to maintain distance. He hadn't taken more than a few steps before the taller officer, Marshall, noticed him. Marshall turned sharply, his expression shifting into something more hostile, more commanding. He barked something in Bill's direction, gesturing toward the truck, clearly trying to assert control. But Bill didn't move. He wasn't shouting, wasn't interfering. He was simply recording. The phone was held high, the red light blinking in the corner of the screen. In the age of smartphones and social media, there was no turning back once a live stream began. Within moments, the video was broadcasting publicly. It didn't take long for viewers to start reacting. In cities and suburbs hundreds of miles away, people scrolling through feeds and alerts paused to watch a grainy, shaky video of a woman on her knees in the Nevada desert, flanked by two officers under the harsh glare of patrol lights. Some recognized the setting. A few recognized the woman. And then recognition turned to outrage. Comments poured in. "That's Charlotte Miller," someone typed. "Is that who I think it is?" said another. "What the hell are they doing to her?" asked a third. The stream was shared, reposted, clipped, and analyzed in real time. The platform's algorithm picked it up as trending. It reached journalists, activists, and eventually members of the intelligence community. Charlotte remained still, her head slightly bowed, but her eyes had found the source of hope. The old man with the phone, a witness, someone outside the power structure, someone unafraid. Seizing the moment, she shifted slightly, as if repositioning her weight. Her right hand brushed subtly against the inside cuff of her jacket. A gentle press, barely perceptible. Embedded in the fabric was a panic button, a small, secure transmitter that linked directly to the National Intelligence Center's emergency protocol system. The signal was silent, but it went out instantly. Miles away in a secure facility, the alert arrived on a terminal as a silent ping. No alarms, no flashing lights, just a discrete code, a digital pulse that said one thing: compromised. Back on the highway, the tension mounted. Marshall stepped toward Bill, his posture growing more aggressive, while Officer Crow turned toward the woman again, uncertain. They could feel the shift, even if they didn't fully understand it. The isolation that had empowered them moments ago had vanished. Now eyes were watching, screens were recording. The desert was no longer empty. Their actions had left the shadows. Bill didn't flinch. He kept the camera rolling, and Charlotte, still on her knees, no longer felt entirely alone. The desert night had grown colder, the stars beginning to pierce through the deepening sky like watchful eyes. The stretch of Highway 93 remained isolated, but the stillness was shattered by the low, rumbling approach of engines. A convoy of matte black SUVs emerged from the darkness, headlights sweeping over the sand and sagebrush. The vehicles moved in perfect coordination, silent but authoritative. Their arrival brought with it a different kind of weight, one not of intimidation, but of control and consequence. Within moments, the vehicles came to a calculated stop surrounding the scene. Doors opened in unison, and from each SUV stepped federal agents clad in tactical uniforms. They wore no insignia beyond the minimalist patches identifying them as part of a federal response team. Helmets with built-in comms, body armor molded to their forms, and rifles slung but not raised. These were professionals trained for precision, not spectacle. Their movements were fluid, rehearsed, no shouting, no chaos. Two agents moved directly toward the officers. One addressed them, while the other carefully monitored their hands. The voice was calm but firm, backed by unspoken authority. The command to disarm was not a suggestion. Officer Crow hesitated only briefly before lowering her sidearm and unfastening her belt. Her expression had shifted from unease to a quiet resignation. Officer Marshall, on the other hand, took a half step back, his jaw set, his fingers twitching with the instinct to defy. But even he understood what was at stake. The red lights from the federal vehicles danced across his face, exposing every crack in his mask of control. When he didn't immediately comply, two agents stepped forward in perfect synchronization, their presence alone enough to tip the scales. One reached for his weapon, the other for his arm. There was no struggle, only the subtle collapse of defiance under the weight of reality. Marshall finally relinquished his weapon, his eyes scanning the perimeter, looking for some ally, some argument, some way out. None came. Charlotte was still kneeling when the lead agent approached her. Without a word, he extended a hand, steady and respectful. She accepted the gesture, allowing herself to be lifted to her feet. Her legs were stiff, her palms scraped, her blazer dusted with dirt, but her posture remained unbroken. She dusted herself off slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off the officers now standing in silent submission. For a moment, she simply stood there, observing. No words passed between her and the agents. They already knew who she was. They had received the emergency signal, cross-referenced her biometric ID, and followed a protocol reserved for only the highest-ranking government officials in distress. There was no need for introductions or explanations. Charlotte turned her gaze to Marshall. It wasn't a glare, nor was it fueled by anger. It was something colder, a look of someone who had faced greater threats, endured greater violence, and survived darker chapters. Her silence was a verdict all its own, and Marshall felt it. His bravado evaporated in that gaze, leaving only the remnants of a man who had drastically underestimated the situation. Agents moved in to secure the scene. Body cams were activated. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers were placed. The ground where Charlotte had knelt was documented, as were the tire tracks, the officers' weapons, and the untouched dash cams inside their cruisers. Silent witnesses that would later be examined for what they did and didn't record. Every step was calculated, every detail preserved. Meanwhile, another group of agents approached Bill Hopkins. He was still holding his phone, which had long since stopped streaming, but had saved the entire incident to local memory. The agents spoke with him, requested the footage, and assured him it would be used as part of the official investigation. Bill nodded slowly, still trying to process how quickly the tide had turned. His presence had been the spark, unexpected, unscripted, and yet vital. As Charlotte was escorted toward one of the federal SUVs, the wind picked up, rustling through the dry brush like a whisper of what had almost happened. She glanced back once, her face expressionless, before stepping into the vehicle. The door closed softly behind her. In the distance, Marshall and Crow stood isolated, stripped of their authority and their certainty. Temporary custody had been ordered, but they both understood the truth. They were no longer in control of the narrative. The consequences had been set in motion, and what had begun as a misuse of power on a dark highway would now be dissected under the cold lights of federal scrutiny. Retribution, when it arrived, hadn't come with raised voices or drawn guns. It had come with quiet precision, with the presence of those who answered the silent call for justice, and it had left behind a message. No badge was above accountability. By dawn, the desert incident had spread far beyond the quiet highways of Esperanza County. What began as a grainy live stream by a retired mechanic had become a national headline. The footage, unfiltered, undeniable, circulated across every major platform, replayed on morning broadcasts, dissected by analysts, and shared in social media threads that overflowed with outrage and disbelief. The image of a high-ranking federal official forced to kneel on an empty roadside, her identity ignored, her authority mocked, became a symbol, and with that symbol came questions, sharp, uncomfortable, and urgent. The Department of Justice launched an internal review within hours. Charlotte's emergency signal had already flagged her status and location to the highest level of federal oversight, and now the full weight of the government machinery turned its attention to Esperanza County. Independent investigators were deployed. Every report, every complaint, and every disciplinary file tied to Officers Marshall and Crow was pulled for scrutiny. What they found painted a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Marshall, it turned out, was no stranger to allegations of misconduct. Several civilian complaints over the past 5 years had alleged intimidation, racial profiling, and use of excessive force. But each time, the complaints were quietly closed, dismissed due to lack of evidence or procedural inconsistencies. Records showed internal reviews rubber-stamped by the same few officials, and body cam footage that conveniently failed to capture key moments. The pattern was systemic, protected by silence, aided by complacency. This time, however, there was no silence. Crow, younger and less seasoned, quickly broke under pressure. In a closed-door interview, she admitted to having long been uncomfortable with Marshall's behavior. She described an atmosphere of fear and coercion, how Marshall routinely bent protocol, expected subordinates to back him up without question, and retaliated against anyone who challenged his authority. She confessed that the night of the stop, she had followed his lead not out of agreement, but out of fear. Her full cooperation, including a sworn affidavit and video analysis, became a turning point in the investigation. Charlotte, meanwhile, declined all interview requests. She gave no press conference, issued no personal statement, and refused to participate in the media storm that followed. Her decision was intentional. By remaining silent, she forced the system itself to respond, on its own terms, without theatrics or performance. It was a quiet demonstration of trust in process over spectacle, in long-term accountability over short-term vindication. The pressure, however, mounted on local authorities. Esperanza County Sheriff's Department faced unprecedented scrutiny. Calls flooded in from advocacy groups, legal watchdogs, and state officials. Protests erupted in front of the county courthouse, peaceful but persistent. Locals held signs demanding justice, transparency, and sweeping reform. For many residents, the viral footage had simply confirmed what they already feared, that their protectors had become predators, that the system was stacked against the voiceless. Now those voices echoed in streets and headlines alike. Several senior officials within the county administration tendered their resignations within a week. The sheriff announced his retirement amid a flurry of subpoenas and ethics investigations. Cases previously handled by Marshall were reopened, reviewed for signs of misconduct or coercion. Defense attorneys across the state filed motions citing the incident as evidence of a broader pattern of abuse. The legal ripple effect was immediate and far-reaching. Bill Hopkins, once a quiet retiree known mostly to the local auto shops and diners, found himself in the unlikely position of being a civic figure. He was interviewed by regional news channels, invited to speak at a town hall, and even contacted by national journalists eager to spotlight the man who refused to look away. In one segment, a broadcaster dubbed him the Eyes of Justice, a moniker that quickly caught on. Bill, however, remained humble, often redirecting praise back to the need for vigilance and community accountability. For Charlotte, the days that followed were marked by briefings, internal reports, and high-level conversations about policy implications. But she kept a low profile. Her focus remained on the mechanisms of reform, not on personal vindication. She understood that this was bigger than her, that the fear and humiliation she experienced were shared by countless others who lacked her rank, her reach, or her means of defense. If her ordeal could expose a deeper rot, if it could drive real change, then her silence had spoken volumes. The road where it all happened remained unchanged, save for a few scattered tire marks and scorched rubber patches. But its meaning had shifted. It had become a place of reckoning, a marker in the broader map of justice, where something finally broke through. A line drawn, not in blood, but in consequence. The aftermath was not immediate resolution. It was slow, procedural, and filled with resistance. But it had begun, and this time, the whole country was watching. Several weeks had passed since the incident that had thrown her life, and the lives of many others, into upheaval. The dust of the media storm had begun to settle, though echoes of it still rippled through national debates and policy circles. Charlotte Miller had returned to her post at the National Intelligence Center, where the rhythm of classified reports, strategic assessments, and closed-door briefings resumed. Her office was just as she had left it, orderly, efficient, austere, but something within her had shifted. Her posture was the same, her tone calm, her manner composed, yet every movement now carried a deeper weight. Her presence in the room commanded not just attention, but respect shaped by endurance. Though she said little of the event itself, The way she navigated her responsibilities reflected a newfound precision. There was no room for ambiguity. She initiated a comprehensive internal review of interagency cooperation protocols with local law enforcement, citing gaps in jurisdictional communication that allowed abuses of power to go unchecked. She proposed a framework for federal oversight on civil rights training, pressing for mandatory programs to educate officers on the rights of citizens, the limits of authority, and the consequences of systemic bias. Within weeks, pilot programs launched in multiple states, backed by bipartisan support sparked by public demand for accountability. Her staff noticed the change. Meetings became more focused, her directives more uncompromising. When questioned about priorities, she emphasized the need for not only intelligence gathering, but structural resilience. Resilience that began with trust, transparency, and justice. She brought in external consultants, sociologists, and former civil rights attorneys to audit protocols and training modules. What might have once been seen as peripheral now stood at the center of her agenda. In private, she worked late into the night, poring over old files and reports from cases where procedural ambiguity had allowed violations to persist. Each page was a reminder of what silence could conceal. She had survived her own moment of voicelessness, on her knees in the desert, ignored, dismissed, dehumanized. That experience was no longer an open wound, but a point of origin, a catalyst. Her resolve was not born of vengeance, but of conviction that her authority must now serve others in ways that extended far beyond her own protection. She penned a letter to the governor of Nevada, formally detailing the failures exposed by the roadside stop. It was not written in anger, but with clarity and purpose. She framed the event not as an isolated injustice, but as a mirror reflecting deeper dysfunction within local enforcement structures. She argued for statewide reform, legislative oversight, and independent complaint review boards with real power to act. Her words were careful, her tone measured, but every line carried the authority of someone who had seen, firsthand, what unchecked power could do. The letter gained traction. Civil liberties organizations praised its pragmatism. Lawmakers cited it in committee hearings. It did not spark immediate revolution, but it began conversations in rooms where change was long overdue. Outside the public arena, Charlotte continued her work in quiet determination. Her daily routines resumed, the office briefings, the classified memos, the strategic assessments, but the memory of that night lingered beneath the surface. It was not a source of fear, but of direction, a compass pointing toward responsibility. She kept in touch with Bill Hopkins, the man who had stopped, filmed, and inadvertently shifted the tide. They spoke occasionally, never about the event itself, but about resilience, small-town life, and the strange paths that brought people into one another's stories. She sent him a secure note once, thanking him not for saving her, but for believing in what was right even when he had nothing to gain. He replied with a simple line, "Sometimes doing the right thing is enough." Charlotte made one change to her travel habits. Each time she drove south on Highway 93, past the lonely stretch of road where it all happened, she slowed down, not out of fear, but respect. She would glance at the shoulder, now just another patch of desert, indistinguishable from miles of similar terrain. But to her it marked a line, not of trauma, but of transformation. She no longer viewed the stop as a moment of shame. It had become a reminder of how fragile dignity could be in the wrong hands, and how powerful it became when reclaimed. It reminded her that justice was not an institution, but a commitment, carried not just by laws and courts, but by choices made in the smallest moments. The choice to kneel, the choice to look away, or the choice to stand, record, and tell the truth. She continued forward, not untouched, not unscarred, but unbroken. And as the desert stretched endlessly on either side of her, Charlotte Miller drove ahead, not haunted by the past but lit by it.